Hey, I'm Tamara Kendacker, and you're listening to the Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So it looks like we're days away from the start of a federal election. The word is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is going to make the call on Sunday, and that means we're in for weeks of campaigning, debates, policy announcements, maybe a scandal or two. And if you haven't been paying attention to Canadian politics for a while, you might be wondering why this is happening right now, since we just had an election a couple of years ago and we're still in the middle of a pandemic. How would having an election right now help anyone? Can it even be done safely? And what do each of the parties need to be thinking about heading into this? John Ibbitson, writer-at-large for The Globe, is on the show today to answer all of these questions.
And it is possible that voters could punish the Liberals for holding an unnecessary election that could conceivably put the health of voters at risk during a period of what could be a Delta variant-driven fourth wave.
On today's episode, why we may be heading into an election, you're listening to The Decibel. John, hello. Thank you so much for coming on the show, and it's great to finally have you on the podcast.
It's great to be here.
So, John, we're hearing that an election is about to be called. Journalists are talking about it. They're preparing to start covering a campaign. And I was wondering, why are we so certain that it's coming in a matter of days?
And indeed, we're reasonably certain it's coming on Sunday, although it is within the power of the Liberal government to change its mind at any time. But we are being briefed on background by party officials. Nomination meetings are proceeding at a very rapid pace all across the country, especially with the Liberals. And it's just a zeitgeist. Everyone assumes that the Liberals are going to go on Sunday for a September election date. If for no other reason than morale, they're likely to do it.
Why is that? Why would it have an impact on morale, do you think?
Well, everyone's organized. They've rented their campaign offices. They've got their volunteers in place. They're ready to go door to door and get out the vote. To be told after all those weeks of preparation, no, we've changed our mind. We're going to hold it later. That would have a lot of people really annoyed.
Right. Okay, so we're expecting him to drop the writ on Sunday. What happens after that? What does that actually mean?
Well, first of all, the writ isn't dropped. It's a common expression. So what happens is the Prime Minister goes to the Governor General and says to her, I would like to advise you that we should dissolve Parliament and hold a general election. And Mary Simon, the new Governor General, will take that advice. So then the Governor General will dissolve this Parliament. She will issue 338 writs of election and say that on a certain day, everyone in the country is invited, who's eligible, is invited to come and cast a vote for a member of Parliament in their riding. They're not voting, by the way, for Justin Trudeau or Jagmeet Singh, although most people think they are. They are voting for the local candidate in their riding, although the system has become so presidentialized that most people actually now think they're voting for a party leader rather than for their local member of Parliament.
And what happens after that?
We're expecting a short campaign. The general feeling up here in Ottawa is that the Liberals want to get this election campaign out of the way as quickly as possible before a possible fourth wave of the Delta variant begins to make it more and more difficult to hold meetings and rallies and assemblies and things like that. So we're expecting, again, a call on Sunday with a short campaign period leading to an election day of around the third week, or at the worst, fourth week of September.
So you mentioned that they want to do it before a potential fourth wave, but why else call an election right now while we're still in the middle of a pandemic instead of waiting until 2023? What do Liberals stand to gain from doing that?
Well, look, there is one simple reason for this election being held now, and that is that the Liberals are doing well in the polls. Nothing other than that. Justin Trudeau was reduced to a minority government in 2019. He doesn't like minority government. He doesn't like to have opposition control of parliamentary committees. He doesn't like having the power of the opposition parties to bring down his government if and when they want. He wants a second majority. And the polls say that he's on the cusp of a second majority. But who knows where the Liberals could be if they waited 6 months or waited until the statutory limit, which would be in 2023. So their advisors are saying when you have polling numbers this good, you go, because no one knows what's going to happen in the future.
It's also worth pointing out maybe that 4 of Canada's provinces held elections during the pandemic and the sitting governments won every single time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There seems to be a feeling, and it's not surprising at all, among Canadians that when you're in a time of great emergency, and this pandemic has been a great emergency, you don't change horses midway through.
So the Liberals have a lot to gain here if they play their cards right, but the opposition parties are very against a fall federal election. Can you tell me why that is? Why don't they want to have a fall election?
Well, I think quite simply, they fear a Liberal majority government. Aaron O'Toole and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh would very much like to keep minority government going. I think they expect that it's not reasonable to believe the Liberals are going to lose this election. They're too far ahead in the polls. But they like the power and influence that they have of keeping the government on a short leash via a minority.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Trudeau has said that the opposition parties have been uncooperative and that the Liberals have been struggling to pass legislation, but the NDP and the Conservatives deny this. And I was wondering, is there any truth to that? Has it been difficult for Trudeau to get things done recently because they only have a minority?
No, I don't think so. I think that's a false argument. But first of all, it is the duty of the opposition to oppose, to hold the government to account. That's what we expect opposition parties to do. But when I look at the major pieces of legislation that have failed to get through, it seems to me that there's more a case of mismanagement on the part of the Liberals. They've allowed the parliamentary agenda to get bogged down. They haven't proceeded as swiftly and effectively as they might on major pieces of legislation, such as that Election Reform Act, such as the legislation that would have banned conversion therapy. It's mostly on the Liberals that things haven't been getting through Parliament. And anyway, it's just an excuse that governments always use when they're in a minority situation. Stephen Harper used it back in 2008. Parliament was paralyzed. I need a majority government. He didn't get it, by the way. And Justin Trudeau may not get it either.
So one of the arguments that the opposition parties have been making is that you shouldn't have an election during a pandemic. And the Liberals even voted in favor of a motion that said this back in March. So what do you make of the fact that the Liberals seem to have changed their minds? And is it possible to have a safe election right now?
The Liberals are betting that voters won't mind, that they'll either be vaccinated and protected, or they'll take the opportunity to cast their ballot by mail. I think we're going to see an awful lot of that in this election. And it is possible that voters could punish the Liberals for holding an unnecessary election that could conceivably put the health of voters at risk by asking them to go out and vote in places where they would be in close proximity to other people during a period of what could be a Delta variant-driven fourth wave. That's a factor that we really can't predict. It's never happened before, right? We've never had an election during a pandemic. But again, you can't know. It is possible that the Conservatives and the NDP are onto something, that if they pound the idea that this is an unsafe election that the Liberals have caused for simply opportunistic political purposes that are putting people's health at risk, they might get some traction with that.
What are the challenges of trying to have an election right now in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, different provinces have different regulations right now about how many people can gather in a particular place. I don't think in fact, I am 100% certain you're not going to see people crowded into halls, standing room only, cheering wildly without masks on. The idea is actually kind of ridiculous to think about. So all three parties will have to tailor their events to whatever the local provincial regulations are. The Conservatives have spent a lot of money on a television studio in Ottawa, and they're saying they may use that television studio a lot. But they have an awful lot of money. The Tories raise money like nobody's business. So they can do pretty much whatever they want. But do expect to see an unusual campaign that does not feature crowded rallies, especially crowded indoor rallies. There will be protections. And God help any political party that tries to defy those protections.
What kind of impact do you think this could have on voter turnout?
Well, I think there's a good chance it could suppress it. Again, there's not a huge issue involved in this campaign other than should Justin Trudeau get his majority or not? It's the ballot question. Should we give Justin Trudeau his majority or shouldn't we? That could suppress the vote. Again, the concerns about the pandemic could suppress the vote. In fact, I would be surprised if the vote share didn't go down in this election campaign. That might help the Conservatives. They tend to have usually the most engaged base, the people who are most likely to turn out. So one thing that happens if the Trudeau Liberals don't get a majority government is they fail to get their vote out because people were concerned or just apathetic, and the Tories did get their vote out, and that would deprive them of a majority.
So you wrote a column recently predicting disaster for the Conservatives. Tell me about why they are in the position that they're in right now and why they're not doing well in the polls.
Well, first of all, as somebody wiser than me pointed out, the hardest job in all of politics in Canada is to be leader of the federal Conservative Party in opposition. It's a party that is fractious. It has several wings. They don't often get along. And Aaron O'Toole, in order to win the leadership, essentially went to the right of Peter MacKay and courted the sort of blue Tory vote. He won that vote and he won the leadership and then promptly pivoted, for example, most especially coming up with the climate change plan that for all intents and purposes includes a carbon tax, something Conservatives generally oppose. So he has alienated part of his own base in the West. He's alienated part of his own caucus. And there's just a sense that he is too chameleon-like a leader, that he will be whatever it is you want him to be, and that means he's really nothing at all. But at the moment, Conservatives are not doing well in the polls, either nationally or regionally. And if you extrapolate those polls, they could lose every seat in Atlantic Canada. They could lose half of their seats in Quebec. They could lose a handful of seats in Ontario. Some Tories I've talked to say that Aaron O'Toole's seat in Durham is at risk.
Wow.
There are some ridings in Alberta that they might be able to pick up, in Calgary especially, and in Manitoba. And they have high hopes. The Liberals have high hopes to take away Tory seats in the Lower Mainland and even possibly in the interior of BC, which would be remarkable because that's traditionally a Tory bastion.
So it's interesting. Jagmeet Singh has been really forceful in saying that he doesn't want to see a fall federal election. I'm just wondering, where is the opportunity for the NDP in this election to gain some ground?
Well, the NDP is always hoping it can pick up seats in the prairies and then is almost always disappointed. But they'll be pushing for it again to try to pick up seats in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, or a seat here or there in Manitoba or Saskatchewan. But their big opportunity is in BC's Lower Mainland. Essentially, that's a three-way tie now. And some polls even have the NDP ahead of the Conservatives. So expect to see Jagmeet Singh spending an awful lot of time in and around Vancouver. That's where the NDP hopes to really make gains.
Mm-hmm. And what is the story that you think the NDP needs to tell voters?
Well, they have a good story to tell. They claim that they pushed the Liberals to move more emphatically on supports for workers and employers in the early weeks of the pandemic. And they're right. Now, I don't really think the Liberals changed their policies because they were being pushed by the NDP. I think the Liberals changed their policies because they initially thought they could get away with a smaller response. And then when the severity of the pandemic really hit home, they moved quickly to increase that response. But at the same time, it's also true that through those weeks, the NDP was hammering for more and greater assistance for workers. So they can say to people, you need to keep us strong in Parliament. You need to keep the Liberals on a short leash because we and only we can push for the rights of workers. The Liberals will eventually and inevitably bow to the fat cats if they get a majority government.
And then you have the Greens. And I think it's fair to describe what's happening in that party right now as a civil war. They're in the middle of a legal battle between the leader and the governing body of the party. Their financial situation is not great. And it's still not totally clear whether Annamie Paul is going to be able to stay on as leader. So where does that put them going into this election?
Well, it would be a big surprise if the Greens didn't lose every seat that they had. The party in a state, as you say, of civil war. And much of the fundraising is to pay the legal costs of a battle between the leader and the executive of the party. Would you donate to the Green Party knowing that your money will go to pay lawyers in a fight between the leader and the executive? It's insane. I've never seen in my life such acts of self-immolation as the Greens are committing. And as I say, the result is Annamie Paul has no hope at all now of winning her riding in Toronto. It would be a big surprise if any Green won an election anywhere. Most of them are going to lose their deposits.
Right. They have an annual general meeting coming up on August 19th, so I'm really interested to see how this whole thing unfolds. So last but not least, there is the Bloc. What's on their minds right now heading into this election?
Well, the Bloc was miraculously revived in 2019. As I wrote at the time, if you want to criticize the Liberals for their heavy-handed, ham-fisted, top-down approach to federalism, in which they basically dictated to the provincial parties, the provincial governments, what they must do in social policy. The result of that was that the Liberals were reduced to a minority government. They lost the popular vote to the Conservatives, and they managed to revive the fortunes of the Bloc Québécois in Quebec. So the Bloc is going to want to simply hang on. I think Mr. Blanchette will do everything he can to hold on to as many seats as he can, and once again to establish the Bloc as the party that represents the nationalist, though not separatist, interests of the Québécois in Ottawa.
What do you think will happen if the Liberals don't win a majority? What does that mean for Justin Trudeau's future?
I would be surprised, and I'm going on a limb here, I realize, but whether he wins a majority or minority, I would not be surprised if Justin Trudeau made this his last election campaign. It is his third. It is almost unheard of for anyone to win 4 federal election campaigns in a row. Stephen Harper tried it, and look what happened. So I think minority or majority, Justin Trudeau's probably getting ready to step down as leader. He's had a good run, but I'll bet you this is the last time Justin Trudeau will wage a federal election campaign.
And John, what would you say to the apathetic voter? We've been talking about how voter turnout hasn't been great. This time it could actually be lower. It seems like the election outcome is pretty predictable. So why should people be paying attention to what's happening during this campaign?
I would say to that voter, especially to younger voters, because younger voters are less likely to vote than older voters, that elections matter to you. They shape your life. Federal elections can influence the price of housing. They influence interest rates. They influence inflation. They influence job security. All of the things that matter most to people in their lives are shaped by who governs us at both the federal and the provincial level. You should watch this election closely. You should listen to what the leaders are saying. You should decide which one of these people you want to guide the country through the next 3 or 4 years, and you should vote accordingly. And if you have any doubts about the importance of that vote, just look at how much government has influenced your life since the pandemic arrived a year ago last March.
John, thank you so much for doing this, and I'm excited to keep talking to you.
I'd love to. Hope to see you again soon.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. Rebecca Weston is our intern. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to John Ibbitson. You can find him on Twitter at John Ibbitson. If you want to email us, you can reach us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. We always want to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.